Why do teams tend to take on the identities of their head coaches? Because you still have two sides of the ball, no matter whether you have an offensive or defensive coach. The answer lies in high school math class. And also, I was hilariously wrong. Here we go.
You are Locked On Ducks, your daily podcast on the Oregon Ducks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Yes, it is that time once again for Locked On Ducks. I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin, D1 play-by-play broadcaster and lifelong Oregon Ducks fan. Thanks for making this your first listen or your first view if you're watching on YouTube every day, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your number one source to stay up to date with the Ducks every weekday. Like, comment, subscribe wherever you are listening to or watching the show. I appreciate all the engagement we have been getting, and we lead today's show by reminding you that this episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. And speaking of that engagement I alluded to a moment ago, that's how we start today's show. We'll get to where I was just so unbelievably wildly wrong later. I mean, massive L on my part. A good news for the Ducks. Don't worry. It's good news, but yeah, I gotta take the L. I'm big enough to admit where I was wrong, but not big enough to ride the rides at Disneyland. So our question today via the mailbag comes from Crystal Waterscapes. Good name. On YouTube, which is one of four ways you can get a question answered here on the show. YouTube comment, tweet with the hashtag AskLODPod, or you can DM me at LockedOnDucks or at Smalls_55. Both DMs are open. Slide up there, ask me a question, get it answered here on the show. Here we go. Please explain to me why teams seem to be so one-sided. Why can we not have an offense that is optimal and a defense that is optimal? It always seems to be at one or the other. Is it strictly a head coaching issue? From looking at the spring game, we seem to be more of an offense, but do have a defensive coach. Is it possible that this year we could have a team that is optimal on both sides of the ball? This is a fascinating question with a very complex answer. I was going to just respond to him, but then I was like, you know what? I think that deserves a full segment because it's really interesting. And the answer to this question, broadly speaking, lies in a place that we all went through at one point or another. At least I assume if you graduated high school. And it lies in high school math class. You can go back to middle school as well. So in high school and middle school math classes, you're presented with problems that you have to solve, right? Solving a quadratic equation, or maybe you're doing proofs in geometry, or maybe you're doing integrals in calculus if you went that far. When you're presented with an equation, think about like an XY equation, right? Where you've got two variables and you have to solve for it and you isolate on one side and then, all that sort of stuff that we vaguely remember. And you're listening to me say that and go, oh, yeah, I kind of remember. I don't know if I could do it now. Maybe I would hope so. When you're presented with an equation like that, there's more than one way to solve it. Some people write everything out. Some people do it entirely in their head. Some people do a little bit of both. Some people use little gimmicks to get to the answer. Some people wanted to solve for X first. Some people wanted to solve for Y first. You're all trying to get to the exact same result, which is the correct answer to the equation, solving for the variables and such. But there's more than one way to get there. And one way is not necessarily more appropriate or more correct than the other, as long as you achieve the end result. That's the end game here. And that's how I think you can think about coaches and how it pertains to the question that Crystal Waterscapes asked. And that's why do teams take on the identity of their coaches? Why are they never, truly balanced? They're always kind of favoring one side of the ball. It has to do with the overarching philosophy that any given head coach has for how you win football games. And much like with the math equation, there's more than one way to do it, and you can get to the same result, but everybody has their own way of how they think you should win a football game. And so a team takes on the identity of the head coach because in the game plan meetings and the schemes that are implemented, all of that ties together to create a product on Saturdays that, in the head coach's vision, creates the best chance to win football games the way that he knows how to do it best. Because there's more than one way to do it, right? There's more than one way to solve certain math equations. There's more than one way to win football games as a head coach. Chip wanted to go at warp speed. Didn't really care if the defense gave up a bunch of points, because he was going to score even more, and he was going to do it very fast. That in turn made it really tough for a really sharp defensive coordinator, I think, in Nick Aliotti, for his defenses to have great statistical seasons because they were on the field so much. So they were wearing down. But again, that's a philosophy perspective. And when Chip was the offensive coordinator, we did parts of that, but then he's the head coach. Now he gets to fully implement that vision, right? He has total control over the game plan on whichever side of the ball he tends to come from, but he can have it on both if he wants to. And so he's okay winning games 61-52 at USC in 2012 because he knows that his offense is going to be very difficult to stop, generally speaking. Some notable exceptions in there. Cal in 2010, Stanford multiple times, but he also put up 50+ on Stanford a couple times. So you see this across all sorts of head coaches, right? And you can just keep it within Oregon football head coaches. Mario wanted to run the ball more than, I think, our offensive coordinator the last couple of years, Joe Moorhead, wanted to, but that was Cristobal being the head coach and saying, this is how we win football games. We pound the rock, we wear teams down, we use the clock, and we're not going to take an outrageous number of downfield shots because we're going to have a great offensive line. We're going to run the ball. So that's why your team takes on the identity of your head coach, whichever side or area of the ball he comes from. Mario came from the offensive line. The offensive line was a calling card for Oregon over the last 4 years. Chip was all about offense. He was never in the defensive meetings. Back then, it was all about who could score the most points. Now, with Dan Lanning at the helm, there's a real possibility that this is a different feel because he's the first defensive head coach since Rich Brooks, really. I mean, Bellotti offense, Chip offense, and then Helfrich was the OC, and Taggart was an offensive play caller, and Cristobal comes from the offensive line. That's the offensive side of the ball as well. And now it's Dan Lanning. So there's a very real possibility that this team takes on a defensive philosophy, kind of a more grinded out philosophy, right? Because you're going to focus on the defense first when your head coach comes from that side of the ball, because he believes, and what he did very successfully as the defensive coordinator at Georgia was winning the game first and foremost with the defense. You don't have to have an offense that scores 30, 40 points a game. You can have one that scores 20, 25 points a game. And if you're only going to allow 10 to 17 or oftentimes even less than that, then guess what? You're going to win a lot of football games. And it's just about how and you'll hear him say, if he's ever asked a question, we believe in being explosive, we believe in doing this, but some of that is coach speak, because you have to understand where Lanning is coming from when he's answering that question. Is he's not going to give an answer like, no, we don't believe in being explosive. Well, no head coach is going to say that. But in terms of the priorities that you have as a staff, it all starts with the head coach in terms of how you approach creating explosive plays, when to create them, or how you want a game to look when you come out on top. That's how every coach thinks about it. And there are other coaching examples I want to get to that are relevant here after I remind you that Bet Online is our number one source for all your betting stats and sports info. You can find all the latest developments, news, and odds, including this year's basketball championship matchup, the NBA Finals. As I record this, Game 1, the Celtics just had an incredible comeback against the Warriors in San Francisco. NHL Hockey Conference Finals, Major League Baseball, go Mariners, they just won too. And of course, all the latest fighting news from MMA and UFC to boxing. Bet Online is your continued source for all your sports wagering information, from live betting to playoffs, esports, and more. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends in action. Bet Online, where the game starts. Think about Stanford. Stanford knows how they want to win football games, right? Ever since Jim Harbaugh was there and handed the keys to David Shaw, they have won a certain way. They're never going to throw the ball 50 times. I don't think Oregon is ever going to throw the ball 50 times because it's not what defensive coaches tend to want to do. They want to run the ball. They want to be physical, control the clock, and let their defense shine a little bit more. Shaw has that similar approach, but from an offensive standpoint because he is the offensive play caller for the Cardinal, right? And Mike Leach believes you can throw the ball 50, 60 times in order to win the game. And David Shaw believes you should run the ball 50 to 60 times and throw it, 20, 25 times a game. Different philosophies. And so that's why, going back to Crystal Waterscape's question here, I assume that's not your real name, but that's okay. That's all I have to refer to you as at this point in time. Dan Lanning, I imagine, is going to approach it from a mindset that he had at Georgia with Kirby Smart, which is you win with defense first. You build from the defense out. The way that you call plays offensively is going to play into, or decisions that you make as well. I think that's one way it could really come into play is, are you going to go for it from fourth and 3 at the opponent's 45-yard line? Now, Chip Kelly's going for that 12 times out of 10. Dan Lanning might say, if we can pin them down inside the 10, our defense is going to force a 3 and out. We'll get a nice return, and we'll actually pick up like 12 yards or so on the punt coverage, right? And win that way. That's why defensive special teams are more closely tied together than offensive special teams, because offense keeps special teams off of the field. But, defense typically is about physicality, right? You think of these Alabamas and Georgias and Clemsons of the world and the big defenses that they've had. And, you think about the big imposing players who go to the NFL on the defensive line or at the second level, or even the corners tend to be big physical bodies, right? And so it's oftentimes about dominating the line of scrimmage. And so as a result, like Pete Carroll is very much like this with the Seahawks, defensive coaches tend to want to run the ball a lot. I don't think we could have a more run-minded head coach than Mario Cristobal. I mean, Lanning, I think, could be similar, right? We don't really know because we don't have a sample size of him as a head coach because his first time coaching will be against the Bulldogs on September 3rd. But that's just kind of in their DNA, right? It's about the culture you want to set. It's about the tone that you want to set on the field. It's about how you want to win games. You can solve a math equation one way, or you can solve a math equation the other way. There's no wrong way to do it as long as you're able to go through the steps correctly and get the correct answer. We're all achieving the same result. We're all chasing after the same result, and that's winning a football game. And some coaches believe in doing it more with defense and special teams like Bill Belichick, and some coaches believe in doing it more with your defense doing just enough, but your offense is big-time explosive. That's Andy Reid in the NFL, right? There's more than one way to do it, and I think that Oregon's identity should in the coming years be on the defensive side of the ball. Most of these early recruiting victories I've been talking about here on the show, which are fantastic, by the way, and a credit to Carlos Laughlin and Adrian Clem, the offensive line coach, and Junior Adams, wide receivers coach. They've been bringing in some really good-looking players on that side of the ball for this year and next year's class as well. But in 3 or 4 years, Dan Lanning and his staff, I think, are going to establish a defensive identity because that's where they come from. And that's how he's going to see the best way forward for Oregon to win games because it's what he knows from his time at Georgia. It's what he learned from Georgia as well. And it doesn't mean the offense isn't important or that Lanning is not going to have any input on the offense or he's never going to coach guys on the offensive side of the ball. But it does mean, and this is another way to answer that initial question about why you take on the identity of your head coach, where's he going to spend most of his time, right? In theory, the head coach of your program is the smartest guy on staff. And if that's not the case, one of those guys who's smarter than the head coach is probably going to be hired elsewhere because he is well respected within the coaching and college football community. So he's going to spend, Lanning, that is, most of his time on the defensive side of the ball because that's what he knows first and foremost. And so as a result, you're going to expect that guys might be better coached over there. They're going to feel like there's more attention there. They'll probably give more attention to defensive recruits on the trail. Like there's a lot of elements that factor into why you take on the identity of your coach. But I think it's going to be, and by the way, it doesn't mean that you can't also have a prolific offense. I mean, Bama back in the day had amazing defenses, and they were playing 9-6 games against LSU. Now Alabama goes out and they can drop 40 on anybody. And they're sending offensive players to the NFL. Mac Jones, a first-round pick. Najee Harris, Devontae Smith. I mean, all these sorts of guys, right? It's not as if defensive coaches can't have great offenses. It's just that that's what they know on that side of the ball, or they know that side of the ball the best. And so that's where the focus is inherently going to be, because it's what they're most comfortable talking about. It's what they're most comfortable coaching as well. And so that's why that all kind of trickles down to the rest of the team. I think the identity of Oregon will probably take a few years to come to fruition, right? Because Lanning has to implement a system all the way. You have to remember he's learning how to be a head coach, right? There's a lot of factors that go into that. It's very different from just being a defensive coordinator. I hope he continues to call plays on the defensive side of the ball. But in terms of what Oregon will look like in 3 years with Dan Lanning as the head coach from now versus what they'll look like this season, it could be very different. I mean, we could be more reliant on the offense this year, and Bo Nix and all the playmakers we talked about, Dante Thornton and Troy Franklin, the tight ends, the running backs that the Ducks have brought in. We could be more reliant on those guys this year than we will be 2 to 3 years from now, when Lanning's had a couple full recruiting cycles to bring in the sorts of players that he wants on the defensive side, and are able to be high impact players on the defensive side of the ball as well. So I wouldn't expect it to be exactly the same, but I am interested to see how much better defense can be in year one with a defensive-minded head coach and a well-traveled and well-respected defensive coordinator as well, like Tosh Lupoy, who was part of a national championship team when he was DC at Alabama. So not too bad. But thank you very much for the question. That one came in from Crystal Waterscapes via the YouTube comments. Remember, there are 4 ways to get a question answered here on the show: YouTube comments, tweet with the hashtag AskLODPod, or you can DM me at either 2 of the accounts that I run, at Smalls_55, my personal handle, or at Locked On Ducks. I will respond to both. Keep the questions coming. We're rolling into the summer months. I'll answer your questions throughout the year anyway as well, but in the summer months, heck, I am always down for some mailbag, and I'm always down to be wrong too. Yeah, I was very, very wrong. Will Richardson is back for his 5th year in Eugene with the Ducks. I feel like Smash Mouth right now, and I got to take my finger and thumb and put it in the shape of an L on my forehead. It's just all. You don't need to hear me sing, by the way. Nobody wants or needs that. But Richardson had been testing the NBA draft waters. He's opted to come back, which, much like Quincy Gary, I think is the right move, because he would not have been able to carve out a consistent role in the NBA right now. I think it would have been pretty difficult. So I just think, Richardson, he's a good finisher. He's a good shooter, but his mid-range game, creating his own shot, little bit unrefined in that sense. And I think he needs to get a little bit more consistent as well. He's a good passer. He does have good size. He's not crazy athletic. So I think he needs to be able to develop a couple elements of his game, maybe extend his range, like Peyton Pritchard has done, who had 5 points in the 4th quarter of that Celtics comeback. That was pretty cool. Hashtag ProDucks and whatnot. But overall, this is good news for Oregon, right? I mean, it is good news that Will Richardson's coming back. I know he didn't have a great end to this past season. I'm not going to argue with you on that. But he was consistently our best player. He was our leading scorer this past year. He was, the number 2 to Chris Duarte on that Sweet 16 team in the 2020-2021 season, when we smacked number 2 seed Iowa and then got waxed by USC and other fun adjectives or adverbs. I don't know, something like that. But over, the past 4 years, he's had such a great career in Eugene. He really, really has. And this past season, 14 points a game, 3.5 assists, 45% from the field. That's an excellent rate for a point guard. Usually guards are, low 40s, sometimes even high 30s, but low 40s, because it's tougher when you got big guys out there to finish shots. But Will's got pretty good size, so he finished as well. He was 39% from beyond the arc, which is a good number. This is the lowest of his career since his freshman year, when he was 28%. He was 47% as a sophomore, 40% as a junior, and then this past season, he was just a shade under 39%. So he was a second-team All-Pac-12 performer. He's going to be our starting point guard. And I think the question, and I'll wrap up with this today, is where does this leave the lineup? Where does this leave the starting lineup for Dana Altman right now? And it's interesting because you bring in 2 guards, and the reason I didn't think he was going to come back is Are you going to run with the 3-guard rotation again? I wouldn't like to see them do that. Dana Altman's teams have always been defensive centric, and I just wouldn't want to see too much of Bartholomew, Richardson, and Kuznard out there, because I just think you're a little undersized. You're going to have a guard, matching up with a wing, and I don't want to see that. And I think when you look at the starting 5 right now, or what it could be, the biggest question mark is how ready will Kel'el be to contribute for the Ducks right away? Because if he's ready, he's going to start a lot, because he's already shooting up 2023 NBA draft boards. He's that sort of physical talent. Is he ready to step on the court and be a contributor to a Power 5 program? We won't know until we actually see him get on campus and whatnot. But I don't want to run with the 3-guard starting rotation again. I think that just limited the ceiling defensively. Right now, with where the roster is at, I think you bring Bartholomew off the bench. And I like Bartholomew. Took a big leap from his freshman to sophomore year, 11 points a game at Colorado this past season, up in Boulder with Tad Boyle, something like that. Coach Boyle of the Buffaloes. But I think Kuznard complements Richardson very well. Either one really could bring the ball up the court. They can both play off the ball decently well. I think Bartholomew's a little bit more of a guy who wants to have it in his hands more often. I think is more effective doing that. But I also want to have a capable ball handler and guard off the bench. I don't want to just have all the guards in there at one time and then only bring wings and bigs off the bench. I think you need a backup point guard, something Oregon was kind of missing a season ago. And so I would start right now. If the season started tomorrow, I'd start Will at the 1, Kuznard at the 2, Gary at the 3. I'll put Kel'el Ware at the 4, and Folly Dante at the 5. That leaves a bench of Keyshawn Bartholomew, Rivaldo Soares, Tyrone Williams, who I think could very easily become the new Eric Williams, both lefties, by the way. And Tyrone might even be a little bit more athletic, though Eric has sneaky good bunnies. And then Nate Biddle, and then you've got Lacroix in there as well. So I think that, after a season where oftentimes Dana Altman would play 7 guys in a game, and I think we would wear down at the end, and that's why we weren't quite as effective at the latter portion of second halves as we would have liked to have been sometimes. Thinking of that USC game at home at the end of the year, that was a real backbreaker. I dig that 9-10 man rotation right there. I think that gives you a lot more depth than you had last year, plenty of talent at the front end. That's what I would go with right now. And I think you have more defensive versatility. You've got length, you've got shooting. That's a talented bunch. That's a really talented bunch, and one that should be able to get back to the NCAA tournament. But this will be an evolving story. We'll ask other people here on the show, see what they think, which is why you should like and subscribe wherever you're listening to or watching the show right now if you have not already. Thanks for making this your first listen. Go make Locked On Pac-12 your second. I'm hosting, talking all things about the Conference of Champions. I appreciate everyone listening. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and go Ducks.